This is a computer tape for a military training exercise. On November 9th, 1979, someone put this tape into the wrong computer at a U.S. command center. That one error sent a false report to the White House. A full-scale Soviet nuclear attack was underway. One man had to decide the fate of the world based on what he saw on the screen. At 3 in the morning, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski was woken by a call from his military assistant, William Odom. The news was stark. Some 250 Soviet missiles had been launched against the United States. Brzezinski knew the president's decision time to order retaliation was between 3 and 7 minutes. He told Odom to confirm the launch before he called President Carter. He was convinced they had to strike back, and ordered Odom to confirm that the Strategic Air Command was scrambling its bombers. When Odom called back, the situation had escalated impossibly. The new number was 2,200 missiles. It was an all-out attack. Sitting alone in the dark, Brzezinski did not wake his wife. He reasoned that everyone would be dead in half an hour anyway. Just 1 minute before he intended to call the president to unleash Armageddon, a third call came. It was a false alarm. Other warning systems were not reporting any launches. Instead of by diplomacy or strategy, the world had been saved by a backup system confirming that a single, misplaced computer tape had nearly ended human civilization. This terrifying system failure was a prelude to an even more dangerous period. The years between 1982 and 1984 would mark the most perilous Soviet-American confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a time of heated rhetoric and profound mistrust. President Ronald Reagan had labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire and was determined to spend it into the ground. In turn, Soviet General Secretary Yuri Andropov responded by calling the U.S. president insane and a liar. It was a war of words that threatened to become a war of worlds. In Washington, a debate raged within the intelligence community. Was the Kremlin genuinely afraid of an American first strike, or was all their hostile rhetoric just, as President Reagan himself would later phrase it, huffing and puffing just part of their propaganda? The evidence, slowly declassified over decades, suggests the answer to the president's question was both. While American leaders debated the sincerity of Soviet fears, the truth was being written in secret files deep inside the Kremlin and acted upon by intelligence agents across the globe. This is the story of that fear, and the massive clandestine operation it spawned. It is the story of Operation Ryan, the largest peacetime intelligence gathering mission in history, created for a single purpose: to detect the initial signs of a surprise nuclear attack from the West, and perhaps to launch a preemptive strike of their own. Soviet leaders in the early 1980s believed their global power was failing. A 1981 KGB estimate of world trends concluded that the USSR was, in effect, losing the Cold War, while the United States was winning. This sense of vulnerability was not just imagined. Moscow was caught in its own version of the Vietnam quagmire in Afghanistan. Its economy was being drained, supporting Cuba and pro-Soviet regimes in Angola and Nicaragua. All this was happening as the American public threw its support behind the largest peacetime defense buildup in its nation's history. Soviet leaders looked at the correlation of world forces and saw it tilting dangerously against them. This anxiety was compounded by a growing technological disparity. The Reagan administration began a series of aggressive, psychological operations designed to probe Soviet defenses and expose their weaknesses. In 1981, the U.S. Navy led an armada of 83 ships through Soviet waters, successfully eluding the USSR's massive ocean reconnaissance and early warning systems. To the men in the Kremlin, these were rehearsals for invasion rather than routine exercises. But one new American weapon terrified the aging Soviet leadership more than any other. What was it about the Pershing II missile, which could travel from West Germany to Moscow in just 6 minutes, that made a decapitating first strike a terrifying new possibility? A new generation of American weaponry became the focus of the Kremlin's deepest fears. The planned deployment of Pershing II intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Western Europe was a source of acute Soviet anxiety. These missiles were a game-changer. Launched from West Germany, they could reach Moscow in as little as 6 minutes. This was not enough time for the Soviet leadership to evacuate to their hardened bunkers. It created the ultimate nightmare scenario, a decapitating first strike that could eliminate the entire Soviet command structure before they had a chance to retaliate. Valentin Fallon, a high-ranking official, wrote in the Central Committee's journal that with the Pershing IIs, imperialism has decided to limit both the time and the space of the USSR to just 5 minutes for contemplation in a crisis situation. This was the exact fear President Reagan would later voice in his memoirs. 6 minutes to decide how to respond to a blip on a radar scope and decide whether to unleash Armageddon. How could anyone apply reason at a time like that? For the Soviets, the answer was to eliminate the need for contemplation. The danger of a decapitating strike pushed them toward a doctrine of preemption. A senior missile systems analyst, Viktor Surikov, later admitted that the basic Soviet nuclear posture was preemption, believing that the US strategy was to strike first in a crisis to minimize damage to itself. This shift was not merely theoretical. In 1983, the Soviet military conducted its own massive exercise, Zapad 83. For the first time since the Second World War, it prepared for a situation where they obtained reliable intelligence of an adversary's decision to launch a surprise attack. The planned response was not to absorb the blow and retaliate, but to conduct offensive operations to disrupt the enemy attack and defeat its troops. As Soviet General Valentin Varenikov plainly stated, that is a preemptive strike. To launch a preemptive strike, however, you need intelligence. You need to know the enemy is preparing to attack before their missiles leave the silos. In May of 1981, in a secret address to a major KGB conference in Moscow, Yuri Andropov, then the formidable chairman of the KGB, delivered a chilling message. The new American administration, he declared, was actively preparing for nuclear war. The Kremlin's response was a global intelligence operation on an unprecedented scale. The critical question for a KGB agent in London or Paris was what to look for. What everyday signs could possibly signal the start of a nuclear war just before the missiles launched? To the astonishment of his audience, Andropov announced that the Politburo had made a decision. For the first time, the KGB and its military intelligence counterpart, the GRU, were to cooperate in a worldwide intelligence operation. The codename was Ryan, the Russian acronym for Raketno-Yadernoi Napadenie, or nuclear missile attack. The mission's official objective was defensive, to prevent the possible sudden outbreak of war by the enemy. It quickly grew into the largest peacetime intelligence gathering effort in history. The 1981 KGB annual report confirmed that measures had been implemented to strengthen intelligence work by obtaining information on the aggressive, military and political plans of imperialism. By 1982, the focus was even sharper. The report to Andropov, now General Secretary and in failing health, noted that primary attention was paid to military and strategic issues related to the danger of the enemy's thermonuclear attack. The operational directive for Ryan was sent from KGB headquarters in Moscow to residencies in Western countries, Japan, and other nations. Each message was addressed to the station chief by name, labeled strictly personal, and kept in a special file. The objective was unambiguous: to work systematically to uncover any plans for a nuclear missile attack, and to organize a continual watch for indications that a decision to use nuclear weapons was being made. Attached to the directive was a list of 7 immediate and 13 prospective tasks for agents to complete. The scope of the intelligence gathering was immense, and in some cases bordered on the absurd. Agents were instructed to monitor the level of blood held in blood banks, to observe the heads of churches and major banks, and to track potential places of government evacuation and shelter. While an increase in blood drives would be a very poor indicator of a surprise nuclear attack, other tasks were far more practical and dangerous. Agents were to conduct reconnaissance of military installations, key lines of communication, and places where nuclear weapons were stored. Most importantly, they were to keep a close watch on the key nuclear decision makers themselves. The directive included a thorough and accurate description of the West's DEFCON, or operational readiness, levels, emphasizing that a decision to launch an attack would require a substantial preparatory period that could be observed. The paranoia was infectious. Operation Ryan was a Warsaw Pact-wide effort. Documents from Bulgarian intelligence show instructions to monitor NATO diplomatic representatives and combat readiness in neighboring countries. Czech intelligence confirmed that compiling an index of sudden aggression was the primary mission of their agencies. Marcus Wolf, the legendary East German spy master known as the Man Without a Face, later wrote simply, "Our Soviet partners had become obsessed with the danger of a nuclear missile attack." By 1983, that obsession had reached a fever pitch. Ryan had acquired an especial degree of urgency. An American academic with excellent access to the Soviet political elite reported back to Washington on the growing paranoia among Soviet officials, describing them as literally obsessed by fear of war. The atmosphere in Moscow, he said, was not unlike the darkest days of the Stalinist era 30 years prior. This fear seemed to affect the elite as well as the average person on the street. The downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007 in September 1983 created a global firestorm. The Reagan administration responded to the tragedy with a show of force, flying naval aircraft inside the 20-mile limit of Soviet airspace. This American action directly provoked and enraged Andropov to issue his standing order to shoot down any intruder. Any air defense commander who refused would be dismissed. Into this tense environment, NATO launched its annual Autumn Forge exercises, a routine event the Soviets had watched for years. A final phase of this training was a command exercise called Able Archer 83. So what made this specific drill different, and why did its procedures convince Soviet intelligence that a real attack was finally happening? The culminating phase of Autumn Forge was a command post exercise scheduled from November 7th to 11th, codenamed Able Archer 83. Its purpose was to simulate the transition from conventional to nuclear war. On the surface, it was a routine drill, but several elements of Able Archer 83 were new, and to the already paranoid eyes of Operation Ryan analysts in Moscow, they mapped perfectly onto their checklist of indicators for a genuine first strike. The exercise incorporated a new, unique format of coded communication and periods of complete radio silence intended to mimic how forces would operate in a real nuclear environment. Most alarmingly, the drill involved the participation of national leaders. For the first time, heads of state, including British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, were reported to be participating in the nuclear release simulations. To the KGB, this looked like political leaders moving to their command bunkers. Finally, the exercise would simulate a full-scale escalation through the DEFCON levels, culminating in a practice DEFCON 1 nuclear alert, the final step before actual war. For the intelligence officers of Operation Ryan, the pieces fit together into a terrifying mosaic. These were the preparations for a real attack. From Moscow, an urgent and incorrect flash message was sent to KGB and GRU stations across Europe. U.S. forces were being placed on alert and were mobilizing out of their garrisons. The intelligence was wrong, but the reaction was real. Soviet nuclear forces were readied. In East Germany and Poland, Soviet Air Force units were placed on high alert. According to intelligence that would later filter to the West, this was the first and the last time during the entire Cold War that this level of alert was ordered. For several days in November 1983, the world stood unknowingly at the precipice of nuclear war. The Soviet Union, convinced that a NATO first strike was imminent, had its finger on the button, ready to launch a massive preemptive attack. The most dangerous Soviet-American confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis was unfolding, and one side did not even know it was happening. Then, as suddenly as it began, the crisis was over. On November 11th, the Able Archer 83 exercise concluded as scheduled. The NATO forces stood down, the new communication protocol ceased, and the simulated DEFCON 1 alert ended. In Moscow, the intelligence analysts watched as their checklist of indicators for war suddenly went cold. The feared attack never materialized. The world took a collective, unknowing breath of relief. The West remained almost entirely unaware of the danger it was in. The story of the Kremlin's panic could have been lost to history except for information coming from a single, highly placed source deep inside the KGB. Who was this agent, and what did he reveal? The full story of just how close the world had come only trickled out to the West much later, primarily through the reporting of a single, high-level source, Oleg Gordievsky. A colonel in the KGB, Gordievsky was secretly working as a double agent. It was he who provided the West with the first detailed accounts of Operation Ryan and the Kremlin's genuine panic during Able Archer 83. His reporting was initially met with skepticism. Some in the U.S. intelligence community, like acting CIA Director John McMahon, still leaned toward the view that Soviet leaders were using international tensions to mobilize their own population, getting up fear for political gain. Yet as analysts dug deeper, Gordievsky's story held up. The CIA eventually discovered it had another source, a Czechoslovak intelligence officer who had worked closely with the KGB on Ryan. He partially corroborated Gordievsky's account, reporting that his Soviet counterparts were obsessed with the historical parallel between 1983 and 1941, when Nazi Germany had launched its surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. This fear, the source said, was almost visceral, not intellectual, and deeply affected Soviet thinking. The CIA's official postmortem, a classified article for its studies in Intelligence Journal, ultimately concluded that Soviet fears of a preemptive U.S. nuclear strike, while exaggerated, were scarcely insane. The report argued that the U.S. dismissal of legitimate Soviet fears left the world vulnerable to the very real danger of a preemptive Soviet strike based purely on misinformation. The 1983 war scare was a profound shock to the system for the few who understood what had happened. It revealed a dangerous gap in understanding between the two superpowers. American policymakers, like State Department official Mark Palmer, found it difficult psychologically to see themselves as a bad guy in anyone else's eyes. They struggled to comprehend that the Soviets could genuinely feel surrounded, paranoid, and threatened by American actions they saw as defensive. The incident had a particularly powerful effect on President Reagan. He had begun his presidency with fiery rhetoric, but the reality of the nuclear hair trigger gave him pause. Just before the Able Archer crisis, on October 10, 1983, he watched an advanced screening of the television film The Day After, a graphic and realistic portrayal of a nuclear holocaust wiping out Lawrence, Kansas. He wrote in his diary that the film was powerfully done and left me greatly depressed. This, combined with the secret briefings he received about the near miss of Able Archer, seemed to spark an epiphany about the unfeasibility of nuclear war. He had come to the same realization that Soviet leader Yuri Andropov had expressed to U.S. envoy Avril Harriman months earlier in June 1983. In that meeting, Andropov had morosely warned that the Reagan administration's policies were pushing the world toward the dangerous line where conflict could erupt through sheer miscalculation. He seemed to have a genuine worry, Harriman concluded, that the two nations could stumble into an irreparable war. The 1983 war scare is the story of that near stumble. It remains a critical lesson on the dangers of a world primed for mutual annihilation, where paranoia can be as deadly as a missile, and where the line between a training exercise and Armageddon can be erased by flawed intelligence and deeply ingrained fear. Operation Ryan, born of that fear, continued in some Warsaw Pact countries until 1990. The incident shows that in the atomic age, the most catastrophic threats may result from a simple, tragic miscalculation.